The night before Christmas, I stood at the window of Graceland, watching the snow fall. It was like a scene from a movie, everything so perfect and peaceful. But inside, my heart was pounding. I was sitting beside Elvis, not Anita, who had been there the last 2 years. It felt strange, but also thrilling. Elvis's family and friends were all gathered around the tree. There was Vernon and Dee, his parents, and his 3 brothers David, Ricky, and Billy. The Memphis Mafia, as we called his entourage, were there too with their wives. Everyone was laughing and joking, but I could see a sadness in Elvis's eyes every time he looked at me. I knew it was hard for him to let go of people, and maybe he missed Anita. But I was there now, and I wanted to make him happy. Elvis was opening gifts, and it was hilarious. He got 4 jewelry boxes, and he kept teasing Gene Smith, one of the few people who could always make him laugh. "Another jewelry box, just what I needed," he said, winking at Gene. "You give me this, Gene." Gene mumbled, "Nah, E, I didn't give it to you." Elvis pretended to think about it. "On second thought, I don't guess you did, Gene. It's got too much taste." "Ah, E, how can you say that?" Gene replied, scratching his head in his slow southern drawl. "Easy," Elvis said, his eyes narrowing. "Just look at you, Gene, a living example of a taste." Everyone laughed, and Gene pretended to be offended. But I could see the sadness in Elvis's eyes again. He had told me once, in Germany, that Christmas wouldn't be the same without his mother. "It'll be hard for me, and I don't know if I can bear the loneliness," he had said. "But I guess I'll manage. God will give me the strength somehow." I wanted to distract him, so I handed him a large, colorfully wrapped present. "Oh, look, Elvis, here's one more you forgot to open," I said. It was my gift to him, a musical cigarette case. I held my breath as he unwrapped it. He opened the box, and it began to play "Love Me Tender." "I love it, I really do, Scylla. Thank you," he said, his eyes twinkling. I wished I could always make him this happy. After Christmas, we did something exciting every night, usually starting after midnight. One night, Elvis rented the rainbow skating rink. I'd heard so much about it, but I didn't realize how rough it was. The boys asked me if I knew how to skate, and when I said yes, they handed me a box of knee pads. This wasn't your ordinary skating rink. The idea was to keep your bones intact. I wobbled onto the rink and wobbled right off. The other skaters made the roller derby look mild. Elvis skated into their midst, calling out, "Okay, everybody, y'all clear the way on the sidelines. I don't want anybody hurt over there. Honey, why don't you get on the other side there with Louise? The rest of you, get your asses somewhere else." They all laughed, and he said, "Okay, let's go." About 25 skaters locked hands, forming a whip. They skated in a circle, building up speed. The idea was to stay on your feet at over 10 miles per hour. It was dangerous, but Elvis knew exactly what he was doing. Whenever someone fell, he was the first to check if they were okay and decide if they should keep playing. I still don't know how no one got seriously hurt, but they were all willing to do it again the next night. It was rough, but as Elvis put it, if you're man enough to get out there, then you better be man enough to take the licks. New Year's Eve was approaching, and Elvis had a big party planned. He told Alan to rent the Manhattan Club and invite about 200 people, his friends, and the presidents of his fan clubs. I was excited, but also a little nervous. I knew I would have to leave after the party. Elvis kept telling me not to worry, that everything would work out. But whenever I brought up problems, he avoided them. If I was upset or felt we were becoming distant, he would say, "It'll all work out, don't worry about it." One night, I saw Elvis flirting with the girlfriend of one of the regulars. She was very attractive, about my height, with black hair and a nice figure. Elvis, wearing dark sunglasses, started making comments like, "Boy, it's getting warm in here. Anybody else warm?" I was so upset that I left the room. I followed him upstairs and said, "Elvis, I have to talk to you." "Sure, honey, what is it?" he asked. "I saw the way you were eyeing that girl. It upset me." "Look, woman," he said, losing his temper. "No one tells me who I can look at and who I can't. Besides, your imagination's getting carried away. I've seen her around here long before today." I was so hurt that I stomped out, slamming the bedroom door. I felt betrayed and annoyed that he wouldn't admit it. I became obsessed, watching what Elvis liked, trying to be everything he ever imagined a woman could be and more. The New Year's Eve party at the Manhattan Club started around 10 p.m., but Elvis timed our arrival a few minutes before midnight. We ordered double screwdrivers, and as the countdown began, we all sang Auld Lang Syne. When the clock struck midnight, Elvis pulled me close and said, "Baby, I don't want you to go back. You're staying here. We'll call your parents in the morning." I was so happy that I didn't even notice how much I had drunk. After one double screwdriver, I was feeling high. After 4, I was reeling. I went to the ladies' room with Louise and stayed there for what seemed like hours, trying to get myself together. When we finally returned to the table, Elvis took one look at me and said, "Baby, we better get you home. You're in no condition to be here." He asked his friend George Klein to take me back to Graceland. I spent most of the ride with my head out the window. George and his date walked me to the door, and I let myself in. Gripping the banister, I slowly climbed the white stairs, shedding my clothes as I went. By the time I reached the bedroom, I was wearing only my bra and panties. I collapsed on the bed and passed out. A few hours later, I heard Elvis tiptoe into the room. He gently took off the rest of my clothes, kissed me, and kissed me over and over. I wanted him so badly, but he said, "No, not like this." It had to be special, just as he'd always planned. His vow was nearly broken, but he stopped himself. The next morning, my head throbbed with a terrible hangover. I felt ashamed and embarrassed, but not at all sorry. He was a little closer to being all mine. The moment of truth came when we called my father in Germany. Elvis was on the extension in his office, and I was on another phone somewhere else in the house. My father's words were clear despite the static. "Young lady, I will not go through this conversation again. We made an agreement. You were to leave there on the 2nd of January. You've got 1 day left, and you'd better be on that flight." Elvis tried to argue, but my father was firm. "Elvis, I can't do that. She has to be back in school, and that was the deal. We'll be at the airport. You know the time, we'll see you then." I was furious. I flew into Elvis's office where he was just hanging up. I hate them both," I yelled. "Why are they stopping us? They just want me home to babysit, to take care of the kids, that's all." Elvis's face was flushed with anger. "We made a goddamn agreement. Who the hell does he think he is? Talking like that on the phone, him and his military upbringing." He called down to the kitchen, demanding, "Where's my daddy? He down there. Tell him to come upstairs to the office." Vernon arrived quickly. "What is it, son?" "Got him, Captain Beaulieu," Elvis shouted. "We just called to see if Scylla could stay a few more days, and he comes off with this cocky attitude and refuses with his jargon about making agreements." Vernon tried to calm him down. "And now calm down, son. It ain't that bad. He was probably just concerned about her being home in time for school." "School? What the hell do I care about school?" Elvis snapped. "Put her into school here, that'll solve everything. She doesn't need school. Hell, they don't teach you anything nowadays anyway." "Well, son, she's gonna have to go back. There ain't no two ways about it. Give or take a day or two." "Got 'em, Daddy. You're not helpin' matters any," Elvis said, but he was beginning to calm down. He sat back in his chair, gazed out the window, and then announced his plan. I would return to Germany, but I had to go back with a friendly smile. I had to do well in school, so that my parents wouldn't use my poor grades as an excuse to keep me away. Elvis wanted me to finish high school in Memphis, and he would make arrangements for me to return as soon as possible. The next day, I boarded the plane, my heart heavy with a mix of defiance and determination. I knew what I had to do, and nothing was going to stop me. I hugged my mom tightly, grateful for her understanding. She had agreed to talk to Dad, but it wasn't going to be easy. Dad was still against the idea of me being with Elvis. He had read all the stories about Elvis dating his movie co-stars, and he was worried about what might happen to me if I left. One day I called Elvis and told him, "If you want me to come back and go to school, you need to talk to my dad yourself." "Put him on," Elvis replied. "I'm not MacArthur, but I can sure as hell try." Elvis used all his charm when he talked to Dad. He promised that if I moved to Memphis, I wouldn't live with him at Graceland. Instead, I'd stay with his dad, Vernon, and Vernon's wife, Dee. Elvis said he'd find a good Catholic school for me, and make sure I graduated. He also promised that I'd always have a chaperone, and that he'd take care of me in every way. He told Dad he loved me and needed me, and that he planned to marry me one day, Dad and Mom were in a tough spot. They didn't want me to get hurt, but they also didn't want me to regret not being with Elvis. In the end, they agreed to let me go. Elvis sent 2 first-class plane tickets. Dad took a leave from his job in Germany, and we flew to Los Angeles. Elvis was filming a movie called Fun in Acapulco. We stayed at the Bel Air Sands Hotel, and Elvis was the perfect host. He'd pick us up in his fancy cars and show us around Hollywood and Malibu. Dad was impressed by Elvis's kindness, but he still had concerns about my education and future. Every time Dad brought up school, Elvis would point out a Hollywood landmark to change the subject. "And over there, Captain, is Grauman's Chinese Theater," he'd say. "You can see all the stars' handprints and footprints. There's Betty Grable, Marilyn Monroe, and maybe even Trigger's hoofprint." We'd all laugh, but Dad was still worried. After a few days, Dad and I flew to Memphis. He and Vernon enrolled me in Immaculate Conception, an all-girls Catholic high school. Elvis was still in L.A., finishing his movie, but he promised to come home soon. I moved in with Vernon and Dee, but it was hard. I felt out of place and didn't want to intrude on their life. I started spending more time at Graceland, especially with Grandma. Gradually, I moved all my things there, even though Elvis and I hadn't officially decided to live together yet. Living on the hill was lonely. The only people around were Grandma and the maids. I'd go to the office to talk to Patsy and Becky after school, but Vernon didn't like that. He put a sign on the door saying no one could come in unless they worked there or had an appointment. I knew that meant me, so I stopped going. At school, everyone knew who I was, and they were only friendly because they thought I could introduce them to Elvis. I felt lonely and unhappy. I couldn't have friends over, because strangers weren't allowed in the house. One day, I was criticized for sitting on the front lawn with my dog, Honey. Even Vernon, who drove me to school, made me feel restricted. Finally, I asked Vernon if I could use Elvis's car. He agreed, but reluctantly. I started going out more, often with Patsy. We'd go to Leonard's Drive-In or bowling, but my money was running out. When I asked Vernon for more, he was suspicious and only gave me a little. I had to ask again a few weeks later, and he got angry. Eventually, Elvis told me he'd talked to Vernon, but he forgot. I decided to get a part-time modeling job to earn my own money. When I told Elvis, he said I had to choose between him and a career. I quit the job the next day, and I had even less to do. I spent more time with Grandma, but she sometimes complained that I wasn't spending enough time with her. I was so lonely, and I couldn't wait for Elvis to come home. He'd call every evening, but I didn't want to burden him with my problems. I'd always say everything was great, even when it wasn't. After we hung up, I'd feel empty and start counting the days until he returned. Finally, Elvis finished his movie and was on his way back to Memphis. He was still afraid of flying, so he came in a big bus. He called every day to tell us where he was. I was so excited, but I was also nervous about the fans who would be waiting for him. The night he was supposed to arrive, I was in the living room with a few of Elvis's friends and family. We were all looking out the window, waiting for the bus. By midnight, the fans were already shrieking. The bus pulled up and Elvis jumped out, calling for me. "Where's my Scylla?" he asked, looking around. "Hello," I said, feeling like it had been months since I'd seen him. "Hello," he echoed, coming up to me. "I've been gone for so long, and all you can say is hello." He lifted me into the air, kissing and hugging me. "God, it's good to be home," he said. He hugged everyone, including Grandma, and the house came alive with activity. I stood there watching Elvis go upstairs, feeling a mix of happiness and the overwhelming energy of Graceland. It was good to have him back, but I knew things were about to change. A few days after Elvis came back home, he took me out in his big black limousine. We went to a fancy store on Union Street to shop after hours, just like we did in Las Vegas. The boys hung around the shop, and the salespeople tried to act like it was any other day, but it was anything but normal. Elvis had a great time watching me try on all sorts of fancy dresses and suits. I was still a young and insecure teenager, so I wasn't sure about all the stylish clothes. "Elvis, these clothes are too grown up for me," I said, wearing a shiny gold dress that clung to me like a second skin. "Grown up? What's grown up?" You could wear a feather and still look grown up," he said, looking at me with a smile. "Then bring me a feather," I joked. We spent hours in that store, and Elvis taught me all about fashion. He liked me in bright colors like red, blue, turquoise, emerald green, and black and white. He said big prints made me look too busy, so he didn't like those. He also hated brown and dark green, because they reminded him of the army. By the time we left, I was wearing a sleek black suit with high heels. The guys loaded up the trunk with all the new clothes, and I felt special sitting next to Elvis in the limo. Back at Graceland, Elvis had me model all my new clothes for Grandma. She sat patiently for 2 hours as I changed outfits, and I felt like Elvis's living doll, dressed up just the way he wanted. Those days, fashion and makeup were getting more extreme. Women wore heavy eyeliner, teased their hair, and had really short skirts. Elvis loved it. If I didn't put on enough mascara or eyeliner, he'd send me back upstairs to do it again. Looking at old pictures now, I can hardly see my eyes under all that makeup. Elvis liked long black hair. When I cut mine without asking him, he was really upset. "How could you cut your hair? You know I like long hair." "Men love long hair," he said. He wanted my hair to match his, black and shiny. He said black hair would make my blue eyes stand out more. It made sense to me, so I dyed my hair black like his. The more time we spent together, the more I started to look and act like him. His likes, his insecurities, and his quirks became mine. For example, he always wore high-collared shirts because he thought his neck looked too long. He felt uncomfortable unless he was in a high-collared shirt, so I started wearing them too. If I did something he didn't like, he'd correct me. It was hard to relax with him, always watching and critiquing. I hated hearing about my shortcomings all the time, but I promised him I'd do better. Sometimes he'd send me back upstairs to change my clothes because he thought they were dull, unflattering, or not dressy enough. He even had me walk around the house with a book on my head to improve my posture. I appreciated his interest, but it was tough to hear him point out my flaws so often. I wondered if I'd ever live up to his vision of the perfect woman. She had to be sensitive, loving, and understanding, even when he made spontaneous trips without me. Elvis had a strong dislike for jeans. He wore them as a poor boy, and never wanted to see them again. He didn't want anyone in his group to wear them either. One day, I came home excited about a new dress I bought. It was a black and white flowered silk dress that I thought was special. But when Elvis saw me, he said, "That dress doesn't suit you, does nothing for you, takes away from your face your eyes. All you see is the dress." I started to cry as he tore me apart. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, not giving him a chance to answer. I ran to my bathroom and slammed the door. A few minutes later, I heard his voice from the other side. "You gotta stay away from those large prints. You're a small girl, Satnin." I opened the door and snapped, "Okay, I'll return the fucking dress." Elvis fell to the floor laughing, and eventually I joined in. I had to compromise my own taste again. Elvis even cared about my teeth. He took me to his dentist to get them cleaned and checked. The dentist was only supposed to look for cavities and fill them with white porcelain. Elvis thought gold or silver fillings were ugly. He was also very particular about my posture. If I slumped, he'd straighten my back. When I wrinkled my forehead, he'd smooth it out or tap it, telling me not to get into that habit. I didn't like him tapping me, so I learned to keep my back straight and my forehead smooth. Living with Elvis was a mix of being loved and feeling scrutinized. I wanted to please him, but sometimes it was exhausting. But no matter what, I always felt a deep connection to him, and I was willing to do whatever it took to be with him. One night, after we got back from the movies, I was getting ready for bed, and Elvis was in his office playing the piano. I walked in to listen and propped my foot on the bench where he was sitting. He looked down at a small chip in my nail polish, and I quickly pulled my foot away, making up excuses about why it wasn't fixed. "I'm going to have my pedicure tomorrow," I promised. "Good," he said, "'cause that doesn't look like my little girl's pretty sooties. You should always keep them looking nice." I was leading a double life by day. I was a schoolgirl, and by night I was a femme fatale. We always dressed up for dinner, even if we were just having a meal at home. Elvis might wear a three-piece suit with a brocade vest and a Stetson hat, and he always carried a gun under his coat. He had given me a small pearl-handled Derringer, which I kept in my bra or a holster around my waist. We were like a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde. Elvis loved movies, and we went to the Memphian almost every night. He rented the whole house after regular hours, because he couldn't go to a movie without being mobbed. One of his guys always lined up several films in case Elvis didn't like one or wanted to see multiple movies in a row. We usually arrived around midnight, and our limousine would pull up to the back of the Memphian. We'd go in through the side door like a royal couple, and the usual crowd of 30 to 50 local friends and fans would already be seated. Elvis always sat in the same seat, with Joe Esposito to his right and me to his left. Before the movie started, Elvis would look around to make sure everyone was seated. He was very aware and could spot any unwanted or unfamiliar faces right away. If someone new was sitting too close, he'd ask them to move. He was a bit more lenient with the girls, but if they got smart or didn't like being asked questions, he'd have one of his guys escort them out, telling them never to come back. Sometimes Elvis would rent the entire Memphis fairgrounds after closing, and we'd spend hours on the rides. We'd try daredevil feats on the roller coaster, like seeing who could stand the longest with both arms outstretched as it whipped and twisted around the track. Elvis loved the bumper cars and would team up with his friends against some locals. They'd laugh and bruise themselves like tough little boys, and we girls would cheer them on. After a while, I'd get tired, but it was always fun. Elvis created his own world at Graceland. He felt secure, comfortable, and protected there. We all lived like one big family, eating, talking, arguing, joking, playing, and traveling together. I became friends with the guys in Elvis's retinue, but he never let me forget that I was his girl. I was never to get too close or become too familiar with any of the regulars. One evening, after we came home from a movie, we said good night to everyone and went upstairs. A few minutes later, I went back to the kitchen to get something to eat. I found Jerry Schilling, who had just started working for Elvis, making a snack. We started talking, and a few minutes later, Elvis appeared, shouting, "What the hell are you two doing down here?" Jerry was scared and said, "Well, Elvis, we were just talking. I was asking her how she felt because she didn't feel well this afternoon." "I came down to get something to eat," I explained. "Scylla, you don't need to be roaming around here late at night," Elvis said, angrily ordering me upstairs. I could hear him lashing out at Jerry. "If you want to keep this job, son, you mind your own business. If there's anyone who's going to ask her how she feels, it'll be me. You better mind your own goddamn business." I liked Jerry. He was warm, sincere, and personable, and we were close in age. But from that moment on, we had to be careful around each other. Now, when we reminisce about those days, we laugh. Most of the guys who worked for Elvis had been with him from the beginning. They knew all about him, his sense of humor, his sensitivity, and his temper. He opened up to them, and they accepted him for who he was. But working for Elvis was a 24-hour job, and the guys were always at his beck and call. They played when he played and slept when he slept. It took a certain kind of personality to handle his demands, whether they made sense or not. One day Elvis said, "Come on, Scylla, let's go to Tupelo, Mississippi. I'll show you where I was born." He called downstairs and told Alan to get everyone ready within the hour. Alan said, "Okay, boss, Richard and Jean are still sleeping. I'll give them a call." "Their lazy asses are still sleeping," Elvis asked. "I've been up for 2 hours. They should have been over here by now. Alan, when I call down for my breakfast, call the boys and tell them I'm up and to be ready for anything. I just want them here." Elvis could be demanding, but he was also generous. The guys' salaries weren't high by today's standards, around $250 a week, but if they needed help, they'd go to Elvis. They'd ask him for a down payment on a house or the first and last month's payments on an apartment, and he always came through, lending them thousands of dollars. He rarely got paid back. He also gave them expensive gifts TV for Christmas, bonus checks, Cadillac convertibles, and Mercedes-Benzes. If he heard someone was sad, he'd surprise them with a gift, usually a new car. When he gave to one, he'd usually end up giving to all. Vernon, Elvis's father, didn't have much respect for the guys. He said Elvis just gave and gave, and they took and took. Vernon would say, "Son, we have to save." Elvis would answer, "It's only money, Daddy. I just have to go out and make more." Vernon resented the guys treating Graceland like their personal club. They'd go into the kitchen at any hour and order whatever they wanted. The cooks worked day and night to keep them happy. Vernon felt to hell with the boys. Their main concern should be Elvis. It was outrageous that the guys were ordering expensive steaks and prime ribs, while Elvis usually ate hamburgers or peanut butter and banana sandwiches. When I started reorganizing the kitchen, I set a policy of having one menu per meal. Anyone who didn't like it could go to a local restaurant. The guys grumbled, but the cooks were relieved, and Vernon approved, saying, "It's about time someone organized the meals. We were feeding half of Memphis." Elvis was the boss, the provider, and the power. The guys and I had to protect him from people who annoyed him. Before coming down for the evening, he'd have me call downstairs to check who was there. I'd run down the list of guests, knowing that certain names would ruin his mood. "Shit," he'd say. "What's he want? Bring me more bad news." He'd stay in his room rather than spend the evening with someone he didn't like. There was one regular who had fallen out of favor, and Elvis told everyone not to let him through the gates. "All I have to do is look at his face, and I get depressed." He banned him from Graceland for years, saying, "If he changes his attitude, maybe I'll change my mind." His perceptions were often correct, and these friends eventually betrayed him. Elvis and Vernon kept some of their relatives at a distance because they had shunned him when he was growing up, calling him a sissy and a mama's boy. Gladys, Elvis's mother, stood up for him and told his tormentors to leave them alone. But when fame hit, they all came back, begging for jobs or help. Elvis would get upset, saying, "The only time they visit is with their hand out. It'd be nice if they'd come around just to see how I'm doing." But he'd still slip them $100 or more every time they came around. If it had been up to Vernon, he would have gotten rid of every one of them. But Elvis said, "No, Daddy, they don't have any place to go. Keep them here." From the start of his success, Elvis put many family members on salary, and all had titles. Vernon was his business manager, Patsy was his personal secretary, and his uncles and cousins had various roles. Elvis took care of everyone. One night, I saw Tracy pacing the floor in the kitchen. Elvis came in and said, "Hey Tracy, how you doing, man?" Tracy, with his hands in his pockets, couldn't look Elvis in the eye. "I don't know, Elvis," he sighed. "What do you mean, you don't know? Everyone knows how they're doing, man." Tracy mumbled, "I got my nerves in the dirt, Elvis." Elvis laughed. "Nerves in the dirt? Hell, I never heard it expressed like that before. You need some money, Tracy." Tracy just shifted back and forth, and Elvis called Joe over and told him to give Tracy a bill. Tracy's face lit up as he happily took his $100 and walked out the door. Elvis never forgot that phrase. "Poor old Tracy," he'd say. I'll never forget the look on his face that night. Poor old guy. That was Elvis, always caring, always sensitive, even while presenting a tough image to his fans and friends. I did everything I could for him. I made sure Graceland was warm and inviting, with the lights low, the temperature in his bedroom freezing, and the kitchen filled with the aroma of his favorite meals. Every night before dinner, I'd come downstairs first, check with the maids to make sure his food was just right, and light candles to create a romantic atmosphere. I loved taking care of Elvis. He had a little boy quality that made me want to hold him, protect him, and even die for him. I pampered and spoiled him, and I was jealous of others vying for his attention, but I didn't always get his approval. If something went wrong with his dinner, he'd blow up. "Why isn't this steak done? Why didn't you make sure the maids cooked it right?" Obviously, something else was bothering him, and I didn't recognize it at the time. The pressures in his life, magnified by the drugs he was taking, made him irritable. I took responsibility for everything in his life and took it all too personally. Going to the movies or the fairgrounds every night might have been a great way for him to relax, but it was a huge problem for me. I often wouldn't get home until 5 or 6 a.m. and had to be at school 2 hours later. Sometimes I never went to sleep. When I did, I could barely get out of bed. Elvis would suggest I sleep in and skip classes, but I had promised my parents I would keep up my studies. Day after day, I drove to school, attended classes, and then returned to Graceland to slip back into bed. When Elvis woke up at 3 or 4 p.m., I would be there to give him his usual order of orange juice, a Spanish omelet, home-fried potatoes, 2 pounds of bacon, and most importantly, his black coffee. Everyone knew it took Elvis 2 to 3 hours to fully wake up. Asking him to make a decision was a bad idea. He was groggy and irritable from the sleeping pills, which made him sleep up to 14 hours a day. It seemed natural for him to take Dexedrine to wake up. I was always worried about his sleeping pill intake. His fear of insomnia and family history of worrying caused him to take 3 or 4 Placidils, Seconals, Quaaludes, or Tuinals almost every night, sometimes a combination of all 4. When I expressed my concern, he'd pick up the medical dictionary on his night table. In here is the explanation for every type of pill on the market, their ingredients, side effects, cures, everything about them. He assured me, there isn't anything I can't find out. It was true. He was always reading up on pills, always checking to see what was on the market, and which ones had received FDA approval. He knew all their medical names and ingredients, just like a pharmacist. Everyone around him, including me, was impressed by his knowledge. We all thought he was an expert. He always told me he didn't need pills, and that he could never become dependent on them. This led to many arguments, and I usually ended up agreeing with him, even though it made me feel like I was losing myself. I started taking sleeping pills and diet pills too. 2 Placidils for him and 1 for me, a Dexedrine for him and 1 for me. It became normal to me, just like seeing him eat a pound of bacon with his Spanish omelet. I took these helpers to sleep after wild rides at the fairgrounds or early morning jam sessions, and I took more to stay awake for my final exams. During the last month before finals, I took more Dexedrines than ever. They gave me energy to get through classes and homework, but my concentration was all over the place. The stress of living at Graceland was getting to me. Sister Adrienne warned me that I had to pass all my subjects to graduate. I wanted to tell her how hard it was to keep up with my schoolwork because of the late hours I kept, but I didn't know how to explain it to a nun. I had no real goals after graduation, but sometimes I dreamed of becoming a dancer or going to an art academy. Elvis didn't think I needed school. He believed that being with him would give me more experience than any college ever could. He wanted me to be free to be with him whenever he needed me, and I agreed. I never imagined a future without him. So, while my classmates were deciding which colleges to apply to, I was deciding which gun to wear with my sequin dress. The week before finals, I was still unprepared for algebra, my worst subject. On the day of the test, I was hyped up from a Dexedrine, trying to solve the problems. I knew I wouldn't pass. I started to panic. I had to graduate for Elvis and my parents. I looked at the girl next to me, Janet, who was a student. I tapped her on the shoulder and smiled, asking if she was an Elvis fan. She nodded, and I offered to get her into one of his parties. She was excited, and without a word, she slid her test paper to the edge of her desk. I copied her answers and ended up getting an Elvis didn't think much of my graduation. He said a diploma wasn't important, but to my surprise, he planned a big party for our friends. He even gave me a red Corvair as a gift. On the night of the ceremony, he was nervous about what to wear and finally chose a dark blue suit. I wore my navy blue gown, but my teased hair made it impossible to keep the cap on. Elvis had a limo waiting for us, but I didn't want him to come to the ceremony. It would draw too much attention. I explained this to him, and he agreed to wait in the car. He said, "I'll just be outside, kinda there for you." I accepted my diploma with mixed feelings. It felt like a victory, a symbol of freedom from school and the pressures of Graceland. After the ceremony, I ran outside to see Elvis. He and the boys were standing by the limo, looking like the Chicago Mafia. Nuns were asking for Elvis's autograph. When he saw me, he applauded and hugged me, telling me how proud he was. He had me unroll the diploma so he could see it. I had finally graduated. Now I could spend every minute with Elvis. We'd sometimes shut ourselves off from the world for days. He'd leave a message that he wanted no calls unless it was from his dad or an emergency. It was just the two of us, and no one could interfere. He was all mine. We ordered our food from the kitchen and had it brought to our room. We ate and then stacked the trays neatly outside the door. The windows were covered with tin foil and heavy drapes to block out the sunlight. We had all the time in the world to do whatever we wanted. We were more in love when we were alone. He could be himself, not the famous Elvis. We watched gospel singing and old movies. We cried over The Way of All Flesh, and he wanted to remake it, casting his dad as the lead. We played hide and seek and had pillow fights. Sometimes the fights got serious, especially after we took diet pills. One night, we were both on uppers and wrestling. I threw a pillow at him and he threw it back. I threw more, and the last one hit him in the face. He got angry and accidentally hit me in the eye. I accused him of hitting me on purpose, and we argued. I stormed off to my dressing room and slammed the door. That night, we went to the movies. My arm was bruised and my eye was swollen. I wore a patch to make him feel bad. Everyone teased me and Elvis joked. She tried to get rough with me. I had to show her who's boss. He felt terrible and kept apologizing. I started taking fewer pills and tried to convince him to do the same, but he didn't want to. Colonel Parker believed that if you wanted to see Elvis, you had to buy a ticket. Elvis agreed, saying the colonel knew best. When life got boring, Elvis would come up with new ideas. One day, he decided he didn't like an old house on the grounds. He called his dad to get a bulldozer and tear it down. Elvis wore a football helmet and a furry coat, and he brought the house down himself, setting it on fire. The fire department arrived, but Elvis just smiled, saying they were a little late. Another time, he set up go-kart races. He held the record for the fastest time. I tried to match his time, but I was terrified. He cheered me on as I sped around the drive. Graceland became our private playground. We had gun shooting contests and thrill rides in his golf cart. The backyard was full of holes from Roman candle fights, and we spent a fortune on fireworks on the 4th of July. Despite the burns and singed hair, no one cared. Elvis knew how to have fun. But eventually, he had to go back to Hollywood for his new film, Viva Las Vegas. His bus was ready, and I hated to see him leave. We walked out together, and I tried to tell him how I felt, but there were too many distractions. He was caught up in the excitement of going back to work. He gave me a quick kiss and said he'd call me the next day. Then he boarded the bus, and I watched it drive away. With a roar, the bus took Elvis down the hill and through the music gates. His fans were there, as always, waving goodbye and urging him to hurry home. I watched until I couldn't see the red taillights anymore, fading out on Highway 51. I was angry with myself. I couldn't tell Elvis what I was afraid of. I'd been upset since I found out his new leading lady was Ann-Margret, the fastest rising star in Hollywood. Ann-Margret had only made a few movies, but she was already called the female Elvis Presley. Elvis thought it was funny, saying, "Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery." I knew if I told him my fears, he wouldn't be able to make me feel better. One evening, he told me about the romances he'd had with many of his co-stars. I tried to stay calm, but inside I was hurting. I reminded myself that I was in Germany during those years, and we weren't really together then. Now I was living in his world, in his house, with his friends and family, and all the memories of the past. I was adapting, even though I wasn't with him all the time. I thought he would be as faithful to me as I was to him. But why was I so sure that once he was far from me and close to Ann-Margret, something would happen? Every time I was ready to join Elvis in Los Angeles, he would delay my visit. "Baby, now's not the time to come out. There's a problem on the set," he'd say. "What kind of problem?" "It's just that all hell's broke loose. The director's in love with Ann. He's favoring her in all the close-up shots. Not only that, they want her to sing some of the songs with me. Colonel almost had a heart attack. Told them they'd have to pay me extra to sing with her." I tried to understand, but I was more worried about Ann-Margret than the director. "Well, how are you and Ann-Margret getting along?" I asked. "Oh, she's okay, I guess." He sounded casual, just a typical Hollywood starlet. I felt a little better. I knew he didn't like actresses much. "They're into their careers and their man comes second," he'd say. "I don't want to be second to anything or anyone. That's why you don't have to worry about my falling in love with my leading ladies." I wanted to believe him, but the gossip magazines were full of headlines about the affair on the set of Viva Las Vegas. The affair wasn't between Ann-Margret and the director. It was between Ann-Margret and Elvis. We were talking on the phone one night and I asked, "Is there anything to it?" "Hell no," he said, getting defensive. "You know how these reporters are. They blow everything out of proportion. She comes around mostly on weekends with her motorcycle. She hangs out and jokes with the guys, that's it." But that was enough for me. She was there and I wasn't. Infuriated, I declared, "I want to come out now." "No, not now. We're wrapping up the film and I'll be home in a week or two." "You keep the home fires burning." "The flame's burning on low. Someone had better come home and start the fire." Elvis laughed. "You're beginning to sound like me," he said. "I'll be home soon, baby. Get everything ready." By the end of our call, I was making plans for his return. I took out my calendar, counted the days until he'd be home, and crossed them off one by one. I did everything I could to please him, from learning about the gospel music he loved to taking good care of Graceland. I felt sorry for myself and angry at Elvis for making me wait. Bored, I started exploring the attic at Graceland. I asked Grandma what was up there, and she said, "Oh, nothin', hon, just some old junk. God, I haven't been up there in ages. No tellin' what's up there or who." There were strange noises in the attic at night. Grandma said she heard them too, lying awake, praying for daylight. She thought it might be Gladys's spirit watching over Elvis. "Do you believe in spirits, Grandma?" I asked. "Ah, yes, hon. Sometimes I wander through this house and I can just feel 'em all around. Ask Hattie, she knows. She's felt 'em too." Hattie was a large, kind woman who stayed with us at night, while Elvis was away. She kept a small gun under the bed for protection. One evening, after Hattie turned out the lights, I asked her, "Hattie, do you think there are spirits there like Grandma does?" "Well, Miss Priscilla, all I can tell you is that I hear strange voices I ain't never heard before in any house I've ever been in, and sometimes it gets awful quiet here, a kind of stillness I ain't never felt neither. But don't you lay there and worry, child. If there are any spirits, they'll do you no harm." The next day, I decided to explore the attic. As I walked up the stairs, I rubbed the gold-painted banister, noting the chipped paint. I called out, "Don't you think this should be repainted, Dodger?" Grandma, at the bottom of the stairs, lifted her dark shades. "Yes, hon, we'd better tell Vernon. That does look bad. Maybe we should do it before Elvis gets home and surprise him. I'll ask Mr. Presley in the morning." At the top of the stairs, I found Elvis's world. There were trunks filled with his military gear, old television sets, and furniture from his bedroom. I ran my hand over a couch, wondering who'd sat there with him. Jealous, I walked away. I found 2 closets side by side and opened one. It was filled with clothes from Elvis's early days, black leather jackets, motorcycle hats, and a pink shirt I'd seen in pictures. I loved the way he looked in that shirt, and wished he'd wear it again. With growing curiosity, I sorted through everything. I felt closer to Elvis just by touching his things, but all I could think about was which girl he'd been with at the time: Dixie, Judy, Anita, Bonnie. I was so possessive I had to know. Then I found some letters hidden under an old sweater, all from Anita, addressed to him in Germany. I put them in order, from his arrival to his departure, and sat there for hours reading them. Anita wrote at least 2 letters a week, all saying the same thing. She loved him, missed him, and was counting the days until his return. She had been trying to become his lover, just as I'd been losing him. Elvis had been telling her she was the only one in his life, the same things he'd told me. I felt betrayed, just as she must have felt when she read about me. The next day, I explored the adjoining closet, and found Gladys's belongings, her clothes, old photos, and papers. It was strange to see all her dresses hanging neatly. Elvis had put them there. He couldn't bear to throw away any of her things. I tried on one of her dresses, and could tell she liked soft materials, just like I did. She was a large woman, who cared more about comfort than fashion. I felt guilty in her dress, but understood her better. I felt sad for Elvis, for Gladys, and for us all. Life could be so different if Gladys were here. I felt her presence in that little room, her grief and loneliness. Maybe it was her spirit that Grandma and Hattie sensed. Suddenly, Hattie's face appeared in the doorway. We both screamed, yelling, "What are you doing up here?" "Child, this ain't no place you should be. Too many sad memories. Besides, it's dark and scary. Only reason I come up is 'cause Miss Minnie was worried about you." Then, as Hattie walked away, waving her hands, she said under her breath, "No, ma'am, I don't like it up here." The next time Elvis returned to Los Angeles to film Kissin' Cousins, I flew with him. I loved LA. It was exciting compared to the slow pace in Memphis. Best of all, I felt a part of Elvis's world. His busy life was real to me now, not just something we talked about on the phone. But his life still included Ann-Margret, even though their film, Viva Las Vegas, had been finished 6 weeks ago. The newspapers were full of stories about their blossoming affair. Each article felt like a slap in the face. I thought, when will this be over? Elvis came home from the studio one afternoon, carrying a newspaper and fuming. "I can't believe she did it," he said, throwing the paper against the wall. "She had the nerve to announce we're engaged." I asked, "Who?" "Ann-Margret." Every major newspaper in America's picked it up. The rumors spread like a disease. Turning to me, he said, "Honey, I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. The press will be hanging around the gate and following me all over for a statement. Colonel suggests maybe you should go back to Memphis till it calms down." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. All the months of silence broke, and I screamed, "What's going on here? I'm tired of these secrets, phone calls, notes, newspapers." I picked up a flower vase and threw it against the wall. "I hate her," I shouted. "Why doesn't she keep her ass in Sweden where she belongs?" Elvis grabbed me and threw me on the bed. "Look, goddammit, I didn't know this was going to get out of hand. I want a woman who understands that things like this might happen. Are you going to be her or not?" I stared back, furious and defiant, hating him for what he was putting me through. After a long pause, our tempers cooled. I said, "I'll leave tomorrow. I'll be waiting in Memphis." Elvis joined me 2 weeks later. Little was said when he returned. We exchanged forced smiles. Luckily, there were a lot of familiar faces around, which helped hide the awkwardness. After everyone left, Elvis and I had to face each other. He walked up to me, took my face in his hands, and said, "It's over, Scylla. I swear to you, it's over." I didn't speak. I just listened as he continued. "I got caught up in a situation that was out of hand from the beginning. She and I come from 2 different worlds. I don't like being exploited. I can't live like that. Don't get me wrong. She's a nice girl, but not for me." I didn't want to hear any more. I looked up at him, half listening to what he was saying and asking myself how I could go on, knowing the future would bring more temptations for him. Love was much more complicated than I had ever imagined. The silence continued until Elvis had had enough. "Let's forget it. Forgive me, please." Then, with that little boy look that always captured my heart, he said, using Flip Wilson's favorite Geraldine line, "I guess the devil made me do it." I agreed. I would be a little more skeptical now. There was still one more matter to take care of. I walked into his bathroom, went through his makeup kit, and pulled out a telegram I knew he'd received earlier. It simply read, "I just don't understand Scooby." It was from Ann-Margret. I knew it. Scooby was a name she had given herself. He confessed later. That line was also the title of her first hit record in the early 60s. Clearly, Elvis had cut off ties with her. "It bothers me knowing it's there," I said. I tore it to shreds and flushed it down the toilet with total satisfaction. "And not too much goes by you, does it, little one? For such a little girl, you're a typical woman." He was laughing. "I guess I've got to keep on my toes." I returned his smile but thought, no, I'm the one who has to keep on my toes. A mutual friendship and professional respect between Elvis and Ann-Margret would continue until his death. After the ordeal with Ann-Margret, I still suspected there were other women. Occasionally, I'd read or hear about Elvis romancing his latest leading lady. I'd see press released pictures of them riding down Sunset Boulevard on his new motorcycle, or hear about a new car he'd bought for a young starlet just before they started shooting a movie. There was always room for doubt. It was hard to tell what was true and what was just gossip, and I'd get crazed with worry. Before I started traveling with Elvis on a permanent basis, I found some notes and cards tucked away in his closet. They were love notes, sweet and tender, like, "I had a wonderful time, honey, thanks for the evening," or "When are we going to get together again? It's been 2 days and I miss you." When I brought it up, he denied everything and said I was imagining things. He told me I was ridiculous for believing the gossip columnists. It made me think back to when I asked him about Ann-Margret, and he said the same thing. If I challenged him, he would get really angry and threaten to send me home to my parents. He knew that always worked. The first time it happened, he was filming Spin Out, and we were talking about his co-star Shelley Fabares. I suggested going to the set to meet her. "It'd be a good idea if you didn't," he said. "Why not? I'm not doing anything. I could come and have lunch with you," I said. I must have said the wrong thing because he gave me a really mean look and said, "That's it, woman. I don't want to hear another word." I didn't listen to him. "Well, is there something you're hiding that you don't want me to see?" I asked. He flew into a rage. "I don't have a goddamn thing to hide. You're getting a little too aggressive and demanding. It might be a good idea if you visited your parents for a while," he said. I was shocked and yelled, "Well, I'm not going." "I think you should. In fact, I'll help you," he said. He went over to my closet and started throwing all my clothes on the floor, including the hangers, and then put my suitcase on top. "All right, woman, start packing," he yelled. I couldn't believe how he was acting. It was one of four things. He was innocent, or I had made him feel guilty, or he was guilty and I'd made him feel even more so, or he was just angry about the movie and took it out on me. I started to cry and pack as he walked out of the room. Moments later, I heard him yelling for Joe to make a reservation. "Get her on the next flight out. She's going back to her parents." His voice was so final. I was hysterical and kept packing, stunned by what was happening. When he came back into the room, I felt humiliated. I kept folding clothes and sobbing. "You're too goddamn demanding," he said, staring at me. "Hurry up, it's time to go." I got up slowly and headed for the door. Just as I reached it, I felt his hand on my shoulder, turning me around. Then, miraculously, I was in his arms, and he was holding me tight. "Now do you understand?" he said. I was sobbing against his shoulder. "Do you see that you need this? You need someone to take you right to this point and put you in your place." I was relieved and happy to be back in his arms. Anything he said made sense to me in that moment. I didn't realize until later that this was his way of keeping me under control. After 2 years of living with Elvis and traveling with him, I was still torn. I wanted to see my parents, but I was afraid that the moment I was away from Graceland, someone else might come into his life. I flew to Connecticut to see my parents, who had just returned from Germany and were staying with my Uncle Ray. I knew my appearance would shock them. I was wearing a tight, form-fitting dress, high heels, heavy makeup, and my hair was dyed jet black and styled in a beehive. My parents were so shocked they could barely speak. My dad even said my eyes looked like 2 pistols in the snow. Under all that makeup, the weekend didn't get any better. I wasn't being honest about my life with Elvis, and I spent most of the time in my room to avoid uncomfortable questions. But the questions came anyway. What's it like living at Graceland? Is it true Elvis never goes anywhere? I felt like they were invading my privacy, and I gave them guarded answers. My parents didn't like my attitude or defensiveness. They just wanted to show interest and concern. They asked about my school, my grades, and if I planned to go to college. Even though I only wanted to go where Elvis went, I said I planned to enroll. I tried to say what they wanted to hear, but I was scared they'd order me home if I said the wrong thing. After that weekend, I tried to avoid my parents. But they knew I was with Elvis in Los Angeles while he was filming, and they wanted me to spend weekends with them in Sacramento. I didn't want to share my time with anyone but Elvis, especially on weekends when he wasn't working. Still, I'd make occasional trips to Sacramento, because if I didn't visit, they'd visit us. I knew Elvis was very touchy, and I was never sure what might set him off. When my parents decided to bring my siblings to Disney, and for the weekend and stop by to see us in Bel Air, I was nervous. I convinced them that Bel Air was too far out of their way, and that it'd be easier for me to meet them at Disneyland. I spent the weekend with them there, but on Sunday they insisted on bringing me home. Of course, I had to invite them all to dinner. They dropped me off and went to a nearby hotel to check in and change. I ran into the house in a panic, because I knew I'd have to show them around. I certainly couldn't tell them I slept with Elvis, so I decided to try to fool them into thinking I had my own room. I asked Charlie Hodge, one of the employees, if I could borrow his room. I rushed up and down the hall, taking things from Elvis's room and putting them in Charlie's. I placed my perfume bottles around the tables, hung some of my clothes in the closet, and put all my stuffed animals and teddy bears on the bed. That evening, Elvis was charming and wonderful, but I was too scared to eat. I was always anxious when Elvis and my dad got together, because I never knew what Dad might ask. Elvis got annoyed when people were curious about the regulars, and asked what this one did or that one did. When I tried to tell Dad to be less curious, it only made him more curious. "Why can't I ask questions?" he demanded. "What's there to hide?" After dinner, I gave my family a tour of the house. I tried to show them my room as casually as the others. "See how it overlooks the patio," I said calmly. "Come on, I'll show you Elvis's room." I opened the door to his room, praying no one would want to see the closets. If they opened a door, all my things would be revealed. I noticed one of my shoes next to the bed and kicked it out of sight. Amazingly, the entire evening went off without a hitch. My parents never questioned the story about my own room, but I'm sure they didn't believe it. That night, when Elvis saw all the stuffed animals in Charlie's room, he burst out laughing. I continued to guard my lifestyle. I was always afraid my parents would look too closely at my relationship with Elvis. They asked about our future together. How much longer is this going to go on like this? They wanted to know. What are his intentions? Are there any plans for anything? If not, why don't you just pack your bags and come home? We think it's about time. Hearing this was my greatest fear. I always told them, we're doing great. I'm sure everything will work out fine. I'd give them vanilla ice cream with candy and whipped cream and a cherry on top, so that everything sounded really promising. But everything wasn't as promising as I led them to believe. Elvis and I couldn't really be happy together because he was so unhappy with his career. He was the highest paid actor in Hollywood with a 3-picture A-year contract, a huge salary, and 50% of the profits, but his career had lost its shine. By 1965, the public only knew Elvis through his movies and records. He hadn't been on TV since a special with Frank Sinatra in 1960, and he hadn't performed in a live concert since 1961. The sales of his records showed that his popularity was slipping. His singles weren't automatically top 10 hits anymore, and he hadn't had a #1 record since 1962. He blamed his fading popularity on his boring movies. He hated their stock plots and short shooting schedules. Whenever he complained to Colonel Parker, the Colonel reminded him that the movies were making millions and that his fans wanted to see him only in musicals. Elvis could have demanded better scripts, but he didn't. Partly because he was used to his lavish lifestyle, but mostly because he couldn't stand up to the Colonel. In his personal life, Elvis was open about his feelings, but when it came to the Colonel, he backed off. Elvis detested the business side of his career and would sign contracts without even reading them. He was an artist who loved creating. He and the Colonel had an unwritten agreement. Elvis would handle the art, and the Colonel would handle the business. This meant the Colonel kept locking Elvis into bad movies. The Colonel's view was, if they were a success in the past, why change? Elvis was also becoming disillusioned with his music. He was brilliant musically and loved all kinds of music: gospel, opera, rhythm and blues, country, and rock. The only kind of music he didn't like was jazz. For years, Elvis stayed on top of the charts because he had a good selection of songs and could record them his way. In the studio, he worked well with people he felt comfortable with. He handpicked his musicians and backup singers, and if he liked their sound, his voice would reach new heights. He loved blending voices and would stop recording to harmonize with the backup singers, laughing and joking, and seeing if he could match their range. When he was excited about the material, he loved recording sessions. He liked to work as a team with his voice, the backup singers, and the instruments recorded at the same volume. He didn't want his voice out front alone. He liked the impact of the whole group. One day, Colonel said there were complaints from fans and RCA that they couldn't hear Elvis well enough. Whether or not this was true, he suggested Elvis's voice be brought out more. Elvis argued, "I've been singing that way all my life. What do a few heads at RCA know about music? I'll sing the songs the way I hear them." The recording engineer, however, worked for RCA, not Elvis, and started pulling back the group. "The old man's tampering with my soundtracks," Elvis complained to Red West and me in the back of the limo. "I don't have a chance in hell. RCA listening to him. Fans aren't going to want to hear my goddamn voice out front. That's what my style was all about. You could hardly understand me. Made you want to listen. And the songs that are hits today, you can hardly make out what they're singing. The man should stick to his deals, keep out of my goddamn affairs. Elvis could handle only so much. He put up with the bad movies, but now they were changing his sound. I wanted to help him, but I wasn't sure how. I tried to convince him to argue with the Colonel, but he would get angry and say I didn't know what I was talking about. I didn't understand why he couldn't share his weaknesses with me. Later, I realized how important it was to Elvis to always appear in control in front of me. Whenever I stated my opinions too strongly, especially if they differed from his, he'd remind me that men were the stronger sex and that as a woman I had my place. His role with me was that of a lover and a father, and he couldn't let down his guard and be vulnerable. I longed for that, and as a woman, I needed it. There were nights when he slept restlessly, worried and afraid. I lay beside him, wondering what he was thinking, and if there was a place for me in his life. We were both in our own misery, unable to give each other strength or support. He was controlled by his inability to take responsibility for his life, and I was controlled by him, compromising my own standards. When things were bad, Elvis would call his dad Vernon, and they would talk for hours. He told his dad he was lonely and depressed, and no one understood him. When I overheard these words, I took it personally, thinking I was failing him. I remember the days when everything seemed brighter, when Elvis and I could talk about anything under the sun. We'd walk under the Memphis sky, feeling like nothing could touch us. We'd visit his dad, Vernon, who loved his old cars and always had a story to tell. Those were the times when Elvis felt the most alive, and I felt like we were meant to be together, no matter what. But as his fame grew, so did the pressure. Elvis started to change. He'd get frustrated, and sometimes his temper would flare. I saw a side of him that scared me, like the time he threw a chair because he didn't like a song. He'd apologize, but the fear stayed with me. It was hard to see him struggle, and I felt like I was walking on eggshells, always afraid of saying the wrong thing. Elvis had a spiritual side too. He'd read the Bible and other books, trying to make sense of the world. He'd hold Bible readings, and his fans would sit there, hanging on every word. I remember one night when a girl tried to flirt with him right in front of me. I felt so small, like I wasn't enough for him anymore. I even tried to make myself more attractive, but he didn't even notice. That's when I felt the most alone, even though I was with him. One night, I decided to do something drastic. I took some pills, thinking it would make him see how much I mattered. But as I lay there, waiting for him to find me, I just felt foolish. When he finally came in, he thought I was just reading and had fallen asleep. He covered me with a blanket and kissed me gently. In that moment, all my anger and jealousy faded away. I realized that even a little bit of his attention could make me feel loved again, but things kept changing. Elvis met a new friend, Larry, who became a big part of his life. I could hear the excitement in his voice when he talked about Larry, and I felt left out. I knew that things would never be the same again, but I couldn't help hoping that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. In the end, I learned that love isn't always easy, and sometimes it's the hardest thing to hold on to. But I'll always remember the good times, the laughter, and the moments when we felt like we could conquer the world together. Even though the road ahead was uncertain, I held onto the hope that we could find our way back to that special place we once shared,